Well, thank you everybody for joining us today to talk about the very not boring at all topic of Universal Service Fund and what is going on with it. I figured we could start out just by giving an overview of the Universal Service Fund. Mike, could you start us off by talking about some of the high cost programs that the Universal Service Fund benefits? Greg, I thought maybe you could talk about Lifeline and E-Rate, and maybe touch on how for these programs, we've got all these other funding streams going on. We've got BEAD, Affordable Connectivity Program. Talk about why it's important to keep USF rolling.
Sure. So first, thank you. So Mike Romano with NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Angie, thanks for having me here, Chip, as well, and the whole INCOMPAS team. So the high cost fund, people often look at it and say, well, we've got these new programs, infrastructure programs, deployment programs. What's the high cost fund do we're doing? And I think that sort of proceeds from a fundamental sort of misconception of what the high cost fund is, especially over the last decade or so. There's obviously been a great focus on reaching the unserved, and it's incredibly important. It's a predicate to getting good broadband to everybody, right? Is having a network there in the first place. And the high cost fund certainly enables the business case for investment in broadband, but it's not a grant program. It does not provide capital. It doesn't provide sums up front. Even RDOF, which was an auction, was something that gives you a revenue stream over time, a support stream over time to help with basically keeping services sustainable over the network that's been built through presumably other capital, and then also making sure the services remain affordable over the top of this. So, you can look at these grant programs and say they're going to certainly fill the void in unserved areas, but it would not be surprising at all to see even in these areas where these grant funds go, to find that there's still an ongoing need for high cost universal service support to ensure that you're keeping services sustainable, affordable, keeping pace with demand, being able to repay capital, recover capital if you put it in yourself, you didn't get a grant. So it's a different animal, and I think it's as much focus on sustainability and affordability as it is on deployment. And that's sort of, I think, the comparison or the analogy between the two to be drawn.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. Hey, Greg Guice, I'm with Public Knowledge. Happy to be here. Thank you, Angie. Thanks, Chip. Thanks, everybody at INCOMPAS. You guys are great partners on so much that we do. On affordability, so Universal Service has a Lifeline program and an E-Rate program that tries to help schools and libraries get connected, as well as a rural healthcare program that helps rural clinics connect for telehealth and telemedicine purposes. What I would say is that, kind of like Mike's saying, these programs are designed for long-term investment in our communities to ensure that everybody is able to connect to the services that they support. In this case, it happens to be broadband, which is the one we care about. And so, what BEAD and what ACP do, hopefully, over time, ACP will become a longer-term program. But right now, these are sort of one tranche funding. And so they do not provide stability of support over the long term. In fact, there are estimates that the Affordable Connectivity Program may run out of funding as soon as sort of mid to late next year. But for Congress re-upping those funds, that program will be forced to sunset. And meanwhile, in the background, there exists this program called Lifeline that provides low-income families support. Now, Lifeline doesn't get anywhere near the support level of ACP or reach nearly the number of families as ACP. So that's an absolute hole that the program will have to fix should the funding go away. But there is a permanent program there to try to help low-income families. The same with schools and libraries. It tries to help fill a need to make certain that kids get connected where they are under the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Some money was put towards that program to provide greater connectivity for kids in their homes. That funding is also running out. I can't remember. But again, Congress would have to plus that money up in order for that program to continue to do its good work. And I think the thread that I'm trying to maybe draw out inartfully, because of some stuff that's happened just as we were getting on this panel, but a thread that I'm trying to draw is that Congress can provide one-time funding in this space and do so well. And they are to be commended for what they did on ACP and BEAD and ECF. But relying on Congress is a to-be-determined situation. ACP, it's clear they know it's running out. It's unclear whether they'll be able to solve for that. So maybe I'll pause there.
Awesome. Well, so earlier we heard Senator Lujan talk about the high contribution factor for USF. Angie, could you talk a little bit about that and the horizon, as that contribution factor continues to climb?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So what we've seen in the 4 distribution programs post National Broadband Plan was that the commission really made an effort to modernize each of the programs to support the availability and affordability of broadband networks and the services that run over those networks, significantly the broadband internet access service that so many consumers and small businesses now purchase in order to be able to attain interesting content from streaming to gaming to cloud computing. And as we discussed a little bit early this morning with Lindsay on our panel on our policy priorities for the INCOMPAS policy team this year, what we've seen is a 10-year delay in an outstanding rulemaking on how to modernize the contributions portion of the USF. So what does that mean? Well, what I can tell you is that in the last 10 years, we've seen a continued decline of telecom service revenues that do pay in to the USF fund. And the commission has not modernized to include the broadband internet access service revenues. That was one of the 3 options that the FCC was looking at. So several years ago, in partnership with NTCA, with Public Knowledge, the Ad Hoc Coalition, Shelby, and John had to leave just a little while ago, but many others, we sat down, there was like 50, 60 of us around the table saying, this is a real problem. When I started at INCOMPAS, the contribution factor was around 12%. And now we have reached over 30% several times. It's going to tick down just a little bit for the next quarter to 29%, but it's not because telecom revenues have suddenly increased. It's because the demand of the programs also changes quarter to quarter, and they take that into account when USAC is calculating what the contribution factor should be. And when we first sat around the table, there was something that was just really obvious to all of us, and that is we all agreed it needed to be fixed. And we needed to provide the FCC kind of the political weight of where we could all agree so that the FCC could move forward and could correct it. So we worked really hard. We worked with Carol Maddie on a report that she published about 1.5 years ago. If you're not familiar with Carol, she's the former deputy bureau chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau. She was involved in every single one of the modernization efforts. She wrote the section on in the National Broadband Plan on how to modernize the USF. So she knows these programs backwards and forwards. And with her help, we identified the pros and cons to kind of each of the ways the commission could do it. And sitting around the table, we had a lot of agreement that expanding the base to include broadband internet access service revenues was the right way to do it. So we then followed it up with getting a lot of other people to agree with us and signing on to a coalition effort, a letter that we then filed at the FCC. And we said, look, FCC, we have a solution for you. We have a lot of political weight. Unfortunately, that effort didn't go very far. The commission last year released a Future of USF report to Congress, which was in response to the requirement in the Infrastructure Act to tell Congress, what's going on with the USF? How are you going to take into account all this funding? And so what we found in the proceeding leading up to the report is that a lot of people were really worried about the contribution factor. That was mostly what people talked about in the record. And there was a lot of support for expanding the base to include broadband internet access service revenues. Even some entities that say that Congress should go further and bring in tech companies also agreed the commission should go ahead and expand the base to include broadband internet access service revenues. So we were a little disappointed to see that what the FCC recommended was that Congress tell them what to do, essentially. They kicked it to Congress. Congress, here's the issues, here's what's been teed up, but tell us what you think we should do. So we now find ourselves in a situation where the telecom revenues are still in decline. And we have an open proceeding at the FCC that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And we have a huge coalition effort that would really like to see a sustainable USF, very similar to what we heard Commissioner Stark saying about we need sustainable and predictable methodology and funding for the ACP. The same is true for USF. And we can all debate what additional reforms the USF programs might need to take into account the infrastructure funding that Congress has provided. But we all know we still need a USF because we have schools and libraries that still need to be served. We have rural healthcare facilities and hospitals that are still going to need service. And many of the INCOMPAS members are the ones that are bringing competitive service through the E-Rate and the rural healthcare program to these really important constituents. So we're all here. We want to solve the problem. So with that, I think I've outlined what the problem is. So let's move on to the next one.
I love it. Mike, Greg, I know you are both involved in the US Forward Coalition. Any further thoughts on that? Mike, you represent hundreds of ISPs. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think Angie laid out well the problem we're trying to solve for. I think we had 340 parties or so on that letter initially, the call to action, which was great. And I mean, that was the product of a lot of work where we didn't necessarily see eye to eye on every piece of it, but we identified the pieces we did and came through with a solution that would have reduced would still, if it were adopted, reduce the contribution factor to, I'm trying to remember, between 4 and 5%, maybe on the south to 4%, would really be a meaningful change in terms of the sufficiency, predictability, stability of the Universal Service Fund for payers and recipients alike. I think we continue to hope that will move forward. We think that, as Angie said, it's been hung up to some degree, I think, in some debates around the future of universal service more broadly, but there is going to be this ongoing need for the future of universal service across these 4 programs. One can debate what changes might be needed to those programs further in the future as the result of the Infrastructure Act, but I don't foresee a situation in which we're going to end up without some form of universal service fund addressing the various issues it's addressed to date. And I'd submit that it's probably been the most successful program of all in getting broadband into these many reaches of the country. Our members at this point have 80% of their customers on average connected by fiber to the prem. Our members serve about 6,000 customers on average, and the average density is about 6 subscribers per square mile. So, I mean, these are the kinds of programs that have a proven track record of success. Again, one can debate the changes that might be needed to them, but making sure they're on more stable footing, I don't think that should be a source for significant debate or contention.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add is that that the program, the funding mechanism is broken when you focus on something Angie said. The revenue base for this program is declining at a time when we have the greatest connectivity in our history. What in the heck? I mean, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that we're having to fight this hard to get this done, even as an interim step. The companies that will tell you should broaden beyond what the FCC has authority to do now, those very same companies will tell you as an interim step, we should do this. And so I'm not sure why it's not landing. To say Congress should do something is to say, let's do nothing. I mean, really, this is and there's no obligation for Congress to do something. 254D says to the commission, you shall craft. And it gave them the authority. So to ask Congress to do something misses the point.
So those of us on stage, for those who are in the US Forward Coalition, you agree that something has to be done. We need to strengthen the base. Why don't we talk a little bit about where you guys might not all agree when it comes to assessing big tech and imposing network fees. And Michael, you're the expert here on what's going on in Europe. And what we're seeing in Europe may ultimately come across the ocean to us. And so can you just lay out what's going on in Europe when it comes to imposing network fees on big tech?
Sure, yes. Thanks for the question and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'll talk a little bit more about the paper that David talked about. So last year, the largest incumbent telecom operators in Europe under the umbrella of ETNO, the European Telecom Network Operators Association, put forward this proposal that the largest tech companies that were sending the most traffic pay contributions, what they call fair share or network usage fees, to the ISPs to help them to fund the development of new fiber to the home and 5G networks as part of the EU's digital decade goals. So they asked for this. And basically, this isn't a new idea that they had. They had the same idea 10 years earlier in 2012, around the time of the ITU wicket, asking again for different reasons that there be contributions made from the tech companies to the ISPs. Many regulators, including the BEREC, the body of European regulators, rejected the idea, said that the market is working fine, and thought that that the fees shouldn't be imposed. They said the same thing again in 2017, that the interconnection obligation, the interconnection agreements and the whole market was working well, no need to change it. And again, last year, they came out and said the same thing. Subsequent to this ETNO report, they said, and I can quote here, I mean, there's a long report laying out all the reasons, and I can talk about those, some of them, but they said, quote, they found no evidence that this new proposal, direct compensation, is justified given the current state of the market. And it could provide risks for the ecosystem, which we can talk about. But nonetheless, the EU released a consultation recently with a number of questions about the payments, asking a lot of details from the companies about the amount of traffic they were sending, whether they were paying to send it, how much traffic was going under different types of interconnection agreements. And there's a strong idea. Many think that Thierry Breton, who was the former CEO of France Telecom and now the Commissioner for Internal Market of the EU, is planning on imposing these fees. Of course, getting the approval through all the bodies, and so there is quite a worry that this is going to change the entire nature of how interconnection takes place and payments, and shift around how the companies interact with each other.
Angie, could you talk about why assessing big tech is maybe isn't the solution here in the United States, and also talk about how that might impact companies beyond the big names that we think of, Amazon, Google, Meta. Talk about how it might impact smaller tech companies, B2B companies, people like that.
Right. So there's first kind of the pragmatic, the practical that we need to think about. But I'm going to put that aside for just a moment, because I think as the Competition Association, first and foremost for us is like, how would you do something like this without potentially skewing online competition in ways that don't truly allow for companies to compete against each other for the various services they're offering online? So in order to bring in, quote, the edge, you have to define exactly what is the edge, who's making revenues on it that then you're going to put potentially additional fees on that then are going to get assessed by the FCC and the money sent to the FCC. So you already begin to kind of hear the practical problems of how one would begin to implement that. And that's not even starting with the fact that, you know, we traditionally assess the services that are getting the benefits of the universal service system, i.e. the network companies who are the ones who essentially have the opportunity to attain some of the funding in order to make sure that there's network connectivity. And then the other thing is we haven't really seen any real proposal yet that actually describes how you would do it, much less, you know, what would be the legislative vehicle to give the FCC all this additional authority. And in the meantime, we have a real problem here in that telecom revenues continue to decline. Broadband internet access service revenues continue to increase. We've seen a 14% increase of home customers in the United States since COVID started, right? So we have more people who are adopting broadband, who are getting the benefits of USF because that is what USF is delivering. And yet it's telecom customers who are now paying for this. So who is it that pays for this? And I think this is a point that I think Greg makes so well. So maybe I should just hand it off to him. So people who've not cut their landline yet, people who, still are using more traditional services are the ones that are now paying for it, whereas those of us who've already transitioned are getting the benefits for it.
Greg, do you want to add some thoughts here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like who in your life has a landline? And I don't mean to disparage anybody, but it's like my mom. Beyond that, I don't know anybody.
Apparently, Mike Romano also
Maybe
has a landline.
no, but I mean, like really, like if you look, and the AARP supports this, right? Older Americans are unduly burdened by the current mechanism.
Yep.
And that seems unfair because those are also the people often on fixed incomes. And so to say that it's somehow unfair to expand this base to make it more progressive in its reach so that it's less burdensome on any one group is somehow unfair. I have a conversation with somebody all the time about this. It just does not calculate to me that we should make older Americans pay for a service because they are the only ones that can still, that still rely on this service. Pay for the rest of us to get broadband.
Mike, as a remaining landline user and also as the representative of some service providers, what are your thoughts on assessing big tech?
Yeah, I feel like that was sort of one of those confessional moments you see on one of those reality shows. But no, in all seriousness, look, I mean, I think our perspective is that all of those who benefit from this broadband ecosystem should be contributing to it. And that includes both the providers and then, ultimately that gets passed through to the users, but also others as well. And so we agree 100% with the call to action, the 340 parties who signed the letter saying, let's include broadband internet access revenues in the contribution base. We think that would bring it down to a materially lower level, a much more stable level over time. At the same time, we think that there are additional costs that can be recovered and additional benefits that are derived from certain parties in this ecosystem that go beyond necessarily broadband internet access providers and the users. Those would be some of these other parties that are talked about in the report. And I was watching the prior presentation. There was a little note there that said, "Who supports this?" Everybody except for large incumbent telcos. We serve about 6,000 people on average per company. We're pretty small. We're about as small as it gets. So, and we're supportive of looking at this additional part of the ecosystem, which is the sort of edge providers of big tech. How do you want to do that, Angie? It's a great question. I think there's some discussion to be had about operationalizing this and what that would look like. I think ultimately you should bring that within the contribution mechanism perhaps and reduce the contribution burden even further on other users such that it's spread out even further, again, across various users making different uses of the network. To the point of which costs are we talking about here? And the last presentation talked a little bit about, well, you're already investing in fiber, there's demand over this network, so be it. As rural last mile providers, we are heavily dependent upon others' middle mile networks for the sending of this traffic back and forth. We don't have interconnection agreements directly with large big tech providers. We don't necessarily always get caching servers in the central office or the data center. So we're talking about demands on those networks. You see Amazon Prime move to streaming Thursday night video. That's a different animal when you're delivering it to a town of 2,000 people in eastern Montana than it is to an apartment building with 2,000 people in it in Washington, D.C. So, these are the kinds of things. We're not saying that we necessarily have the right answer right now, but this is something that should certainly be looked at as part of a staging of contribution reform and not just be foreclosed necessarily.
And if I could maybe just jump in real quick on that, because at Public Knowledge, we don't necessarily have a position on this issue because of what Angie said. It's really kind of a talking point at this point. Once you ask somebody for the detail, it kind of starts to fall apart pretty quickly. That said, the FCC is, while they may lack the authority to do some of this, they don't lack the authority to maybe ask the questions, right? And I think there can be benefit derived from asking those questions as part of development of a record that can then be used to inform Congress. As Angie did point out in the future of USF, I think a number of parties did comment on this. But again, we did not get to that level of detail that people can focus their minds on when you say, do maybe as an adjunct to the NPRM, where they have clear authority, maybe an NOI that seeks comment on how they might operationalize some of this, because they are very difficult and complex questions. And so I think the FCC might be able to help facilitate that discussion for Congress.
Michael, do you have any further thoughts on, what Angie was saying is how do you define an edge provider, how this might impact the smaller tech companies?
Sure. I mean, ultimately it could impact all of us because a lot of the focus is on video, streaming video. you know, in South Korea, they're complaining about, you know, the amount of video that's being generated from the shows, one of which is theirs, and I've forgotten the name of it because I haven't seen it. What's the South Korean? Anyway,
Squid Game.
Squid Game. There we go. So they developed this amazing show that everyone except me has watched, and you know, and they've started imposing network fees on that, and people are starting to pull out of the country, and so there's been all these unintended consequences. And that was focusing on video, but if you take it to the extreme, it's going to also impact streaming cloud companies. And we're all customers of cloud companies. Broadcasters use cloud companies to deliver online their content. Others are using it. We're using it every day for email, for everything. So ultimately, there could be an impact on everyone and on the investments that David was talking about.
Yeah, and we're seeing more partnerships, right, that are happening between the tech companies, the streaming companies, and the ISPs to deliver the traffic, you know, much closer and sometimes inside the facilities of these ISPs. And because in part, the availability of an open internet with access to all kinds of content really allows the consumers to choose the services that they want. And what we're finding in the US, right, the video is cheaper when you're relying on it online versus when you're just purchasing a package of like traditional linear cable programming from the cable provider. Or if you're in my situation, I have access to Verizon's Fios product and I still take linear television, but I could cut the cord and purchase YouTube television instead, or a series of packages. And it's nice for consumers to be able to choose what it is that they want. And from the broadband provider's perspective, and our members' experience, not having to deliver video, not having to compete on the triple play has actually opened up an opportunity for them to be able to build more. They were losing money on video, $10 to $15 per subscriber. And now they don't, because they don't have to provide it. They can just say, here's your broadband service. What would you like to take? One of our member companies even has a program. They operate in a rural area in Maine and Vermont, and they have a lot of consumers that are older consumers who struggle, you know, with trying to move to something completely different. It's like a technology transition, right? I'm getting my broadband service. Now I have all these different video packages I can choose. I can choose Netflix or I can choose Hulu. So they actually have a program that helps customers understand what their video options are and then how to opt into those options. And we see other really interesting partnerships too. I mean, honestly, I'm a Netflix subscriber through my T-Mobile subscribership. That's how I and my family watch Netflix now, is because we subscribe to T-Mobile. So I think we want to be really mindful about impacts that could happen, how we could change incentives, investment incentives that are going on, and what the current business case is for the deployment of broadband.
So the title of this panel is USF is broken. How do we fix it? We have a couple minutes left. Any final thoughts on how we fix this?
So, I mean, I'll start with, I guess, you know, I think the USF Forward report charts a good course to start. I really think it gives the commission, it evaluated all the data that was available out there, gives the commission options, puts forward something that's within the commission's ready authority. Again, we have some differences of opinion perhaps about other steps the commission could or should take. There's some practical considerations to be had for sure. The last thing I'll just note that's sort of you know, and this is a weird note to end on very quickly, but there's a court case out there too that is potentially fundamentally calling into question the ability of the commission to collect its contributions, from providers. We think there are a lot of good arguments in favor of why the commission has the authority to do that. We hope that the courts will agree with that in the end. I think the precedent is on our side, but that could be a catalyst as well for fundamental change and reexamination in this area too. It would just be a shame if we had to come to that in order for that to happen. We think there's a record out there already for this to move forward.
Yeah, it's there is this court case pending. I think the precedent's pretty clear where it should end, but we do have some different judges now. The only thing I would add is, yeah, I think, look, we made it clear, like, this is an option. As in our letter that we all signed on to, We just said like, hey, let's start an NPRM and put the issue to the public and let's see what we get. So we certainly support bias as being that outcome, but we're willing to have others weigh in and put their views forward. The last thing I would say, and to Michael's point, I really, PK is opposed to sending party base, the European model of having this done. It's just, it smacks of a lot of bad problems. So given the brevity, I'll stop there.
Right. No, I don't want to be negative, but I think the way not to fix it is to start regulating and imposing charges on a market that's been working for 25 or 30 years and that has been leading to investments that are bringing content closer to users, lowering costs for the ISPs, and lowering the latency, making it more resilient, and trying to impact that as a way of solving a different problem, I think would be a bad solution.
Angie, any final thoughts?
Yeah, in 2011, we did a report and order at the FCC that was the transformation order for universal service. And it also included in it extraction of intercarrier compensation on voice services, i.e. we went to bill and keep, and we did that for a reason, right? We wanted to make subsidies more explicit. We wanted to provide for broadband network access to consumers in rural areas. And I think largely it was successful in doing that. So I think that Michael's absolutely right, like why we would want to impose access charges in the internet world. It sounds like a really bad idea, something that economists were telling us for years was a problem in the US on voice. We finally fixed it. And anytime Carol Maddie says, here's the way you should do this, and she was the author of the National Broadband Plan chapter on all of this, right? I think we should keep following her advice and fix the problem as soon as possible, expand the base to include broadband internet access service revenues. Then we can continue to debate these other issues. Happy to do that then. But we feel like this is the way forward. Hence, we call it the US Forward Coalition. So can we end on that?
On that note, thank you so much to all of you. Thanks for having us.